great honour to come to give the speech for the commemoration day, and inevitably I reflected on the history of Buddhism in Britain, and how moments like this are kind of, particularly around a full moon, they're sort of little moments when we can find ourselves linked to people in the past who've also been Buddhists and have also been interested in the same sort of subjects. And of course the full moon is time for Jātaka stories as well. So I will explore them a little. I asked before whether I should make the talk academic or just tell some stories, and I was told that I should try and do both. So, I also prefer the stories to the academic side, but I promise you that a little bit of academic stuff will actually propel my argument. For some time, we've been very influenced by Buddhism in the West. We've had the mindfulness movement, and various aspects of Buddhist practice have affected Western and thus international discourse. So, what are the relevance of the Jātaka stories? Aren't they just stories for children? And of course, they are stories for children, but I will say that there is no evidence in the early texts that they were ever composed for children, so we needn't feel embarrassed about enjoying them. Everybody listened to stories in ancient times, and there was no sense that a particular audience needed to be very young. The other thing that needs to be said about them is that they are regarded as one of the limbs, the angas of the teaching, and so thus have a central importance which is just as important as the Buddhist texts we see so often sold in Buddhist shops. And if you ask about Buddhism, you will get certain theories told to you. But the Jātakas are a limb of the teaching. They are just as important. And I've had the experience on a number of occasions of saying I work on Jātakas, and people say, well, don't you think you ought to be doing some real Buddhism? So this is real Buddhism. I would also like to argue that they are very relevant indeed to modern society and to our understanding of what it is to live in a secular world. Now, for those, I can't believe that there isn't anybody here who doesn't know, but in case you don't, the Jātakas are the stories that are the blossomings or the product of the Bodhisattva vow. That when the Buddha-to-be Gautama took the vow to be a Bodhisattva, microphone on? Yeah. At the feet of the earlier Buddha, Dipankara, he made a resolve to cultivate a state of mind, a citta, a bodhi, which would take him through many, many lifetimes and different kinds of experience till his final life when he would become Buddha. And actually this is a very creative frame story, because it means that we have in Jātakas actually a very rich selection of all kinds of epic, tragic, comic, folk, satiric literature, and some works which are even like the novel. So I can't begin to go into all the kinds of genres within the Jātakas, but it is actually a very sophisticated linking device, because awakening can be found in any situation, and the Jātakas show how any situation can be a means of arousing mindfulness and alertness. Now, there is one list, this is perhaps a little bit more academic side, but I think it's very interesting, which I wanted to mention here, which permeates the Jātakas. Now, one of them is the 10 perfections, which is the qualities the Bodhisattva's trying to arouse. But there are also a list of 10 other things, which are called the good 10 dhammas of the Rajadharma, the just king. And I read this list, and I thought, my goodness, this is a completely secular list. It doesn't matter what faith you are or what code you follow. this list is actually applicable in all sorts of situations. So I'll just say them in Pali: Dhanang, Silang, Parichagang, Ajavang, Madhavang, Tapang, Akodang, Avihink, Sancha, Katincha, Avirodanang. So that is generosity and morality. Now, obviously, I knew when I came here I'd probably eat too much cake, because Sri Lankans are renowned for their Dharma, and this is actually an essential element. I think it's an essential psychological element too of all our discourse, to have an underlying attitude of generosity. Other people may disagree with this, but there is the very famous story of the hare from the Bodhisattva's hare on the night of the full moon, jumping into the fire so that he could feed his flesh to a hungry ascetic. In fact, it is a very subtle story, because King Shaka, who in a way represents common sense and mindfulness and keeping your feet on the ground, actually makes sure that the fire doesn't burn him. But it's that kind of willingness to be open. And this, I think, is a very interesting first in the list of 10 Dhammas of a ruler. Now, the Dhammaraja does refer specifically to a universal monarch, or a king who deals with all the people around with fairness and justice. And he probably, although we don't have the historical evidence, it would be models of this kind which would have inspired Ashoka with his movements and the wish to rule by Dhamma and not by force. And this list shows us that the beginning is generosity. The next stage is sila, or morality. And again, I find the 5 precepts completely secular. Not to kill, not to steal, not to harm others through, or oneself through, sexual practices, not to lie, and not to let the mind become too intoxicated. These are all basic ethical standards, and I actually teach Buddhism to students and adult students in Oxford, and we have a kind of quiz in the class where they have to decide what would you do if a wasp gets into the car? Would you kill it or just let it go? And nearly always the ethical, according to the 5 precepts, is actually the most effective means, because of course if you get a wasp in your car, the very best thing to do is just to open the window and let it go. It's not to kill it, to try and kill it. And there are a number of little quiz questions like that. And people see then that the 5 precepts are actually much richer than we think they are. They can sound a bit sort of, oh, well, you know, I've got to try and behave myself. But people enjoy thinking about the precepts when they apply them to real situations and actually have to think round them. Another one of the quiz questions is, if your friend's wearing a horrible dress and she asks you if you like it, if it's a nice dress, what do you do? And they have to think of something to say that would be truthful. So there are a number of little things like that. The intention of the quiz is to demonstrate how much ethics are very much part of our life, how much they're locally influenced. You know, if you're on the tube, there is a certain ethical code which nobody's been taught, but which everybody has learnt through going on the tube every day. I notice this because I live in the country and I often break unspoken rules on the tube, standing in the wrong place and getting on in certain things. So there are local mores about morality, but that is why the 5 precepts are so good, because they go right back to the first principles. The other thing about morality people always notice in these classes is that it is creative. So at the end, I'll just tell one of the Jātaka stories I'll tell is about this kind of creative aspect of ethics. That actually you can't really be ethical unless you're willing to be a little bit creative in looking at events and situations. But I'll come on to that. The third in the list is parichaga, the willingness just to give up things. The fourth is straightness or integrity. The fifth is madhava, softness or kindness. The sixth is tapa, that's a willingness to exercise control, like some people are wearing white and perhaps on the precepts today. Akoda, that's the absence of anger or loving kindness. Avahimsa, the absence of harm, compassion. Khanti, which is forbearance, cheerful forbearance, and gentleness, avirodhana. Now, I think that list is completely secular. The Bodhisattva always teaches it to anybody in charge of any situation, and to kings, he always gives them that list of 10. If you keep to these qualities, you will be a good ruler. And I think they apply to all sorts of situations. If we're all, if I'm a teacher, I'm a sort of ruler in the classroom, in inverted commas. Those are all qualities I need to work at as a teacher, so that just to be effective. And this is why I think the list is so useful, and it is internationally applicable. When I went to Sri Lanka last time, I went with some friends to see a temple where there was a Bodhi Puja going on, which I've always wanted to see, so I was very keen to see it. And because I was from Oxford University, the people I was with wanted to shield me from it and said, look, you don't do that because that's not real Buddhism. This is something you don't... And they obviously felt, and this is why I take every opportunity to say this in a way, in a public context, that Westerners wanted a kind of Buddhism which they had almost invented, of a kind of scientific kind, rather than the actual living Buddhism. But I would argue, and I feel this is demonstrated in Jātakas, that actually the Buddhism that is shown by them is one that is much more flexible. It isn't scientific rationalist necessarily, but it has an emotional precision and an applicability which I feel is very useful for us on the international stage. So, we go to the word Dhamma. This is one of the Dhammas of the king. And these, the Dhamma here is law or principle, living in accordance with how things are and with the way things go. So Dhamma is the teaching, it's living in accordance with the law, and it is, in some ways, it could be defined as principle. So these are 10 principles that we can try and apply. There is a little bit of academic stuff here which I won't spend a very long time on. I think this list is very early, and in fact the Buddha in his early texts describes, when he's talking about Brahmins many years ago, he says they used to practice sila, ajapang, madhavang, straightness, softness, asceticism, non-harm, and he actually basically uses this list to describe a secular code that the Brahmins used to maintain and for which they were very famous and they prospered at that time. So it is a list which was actually constructed with the intention of being universally applicable. And I like the avirodhana as the last one, in the position of equanimity, if you like. This is the ability to act in accordance with the circumstances. Now, why are these applicable? You know, these are old stories. Why are they applicable in modern days? And the reason I think is actually quite a specific one, that every time the Bodhisattva is reborn, he's in a new situation, in rules and situations and customs that are completely different, possibly, than the situation before. So he has to find his feet in an unfamiliar setting. And I think this is one of the great excellences of the Jātakas, that they show the Bodhisattva as genuinely as a very human, if you like, character, whatever rebirth he has, so that if he is a hare or a swan, he has these somehow very relatable and human qualities, and we can empathise with him and empathise with him in his new situation. Many of the stories he's either a king, but in more often he's the advisor to the king. There are a lot of stories in which he tells the king how to rule and how to behave with other people. So in Jātaka 396, the Bodhisattva is the advisor to a weak and corrupt king, and the Bodhisattva points him out a big room which has 30 rafters of sara wood and asks him if it is strong. The king says it is, and the Bodhisattva reminds him that just as the peak of a roof does not fall if the rafters are firmly fixed as a port, so a king will remain in place only through taking the advice of his supporters. So it's very practical and pragmatic advice. And there is no Buddha alive in the time of the Jātakas because the Bodhisattva is always struggling on his own. So I think many of us feel that we're in situations where we are facing a world perhaps without obvious values or a core code that we can find. So this is where I think the Jātakas actually have a great deal to offer the international community, because it suggests a code which can be followed by others. And there is a lot of discussion about what are the codes of ethics for international communities. And it seems to me that the Jātakas actually have a lot of material which, if read sensitively, could be applied in all sorts of situations. So I thought I'd just go through now a couple of stories and just demonstrate how I feel they are useful. So in the first story I'd like to talk about is the Mahāsada or Umaga Jātaka, which I understand is particularly popular in Sri Lanka. And in a way, there is no need for me to tell you the story, but I will, because there may be some people who are unfamiliar with it. This is where the Bodhisattva, it's one of the few occasions where the Bodhisattva does something remarkable. Birth, he walks a bit, and it is considered in some traditions to be the penultimate one before Vasantra. Vasantra is the anti-penultimate. The heaven is the penultimate, and this is considered by many to be the one before that. There is some disagreement about this, so I won't go into all of that. It is a wonderful story of the Bodhisattva born as a very simple boy in not a very high caste, on the outskirts of the city and the palace, so really quite a humble beginning, for which he is often teased during the story. But he has a remarkable ability to solve riddles and puzzles and situation. And because I'm interested in puzzles in other literatures as well, I've really enjoyed looking at these. Eventually he attracts the attention of the king, who has 4 very stupid ministers, as well as being a very stupid king. So the Bodhisattva has to find a way of helping the king to sustain his kingdom and to live with a lot of very stupid and foolish people around him. And he does, of course, manage to do this and to bring success to the country through his good advice. Now, I'd like to look a little bit more closely at some of the puzzles and the riddles. Now, I realise that being an English literature specialist, I'm always keen to look at the metaphorical, the symbolic aspect of things, but some of these aren't symbolic at all, and they're just really very, very clever. And some of them are symbolic, but in a very interesting way that I think we can respond to. The images throughout this tale of a tunnel, the tunnel he produces as an escape route from the enemy city, the shell where you have to, which goes round and round and round, and the ants have to go and pull a thread through it. All these funny little puzzles that come up, and hidden walkways and secret messages. It's really like a very ancient spy story, if you like, or a thriller.
But the feature I want to draw attention to is the creative morality of the Mahānipāta Jātaka. Because in this story, the Bodhisattva is moral, he keeps an ethical code, but he also exercises the payakusala, the skill in means. So when he's posed with a lot of riddles, he always looks beneath the surface and can see what's going on underneath. And one of them, for instance, is the two ladies who are swimming in a pond. One lady has just made herself a beautiful necklace from threads, and the other lady asks her if she can try it on. She said, "Oh, I love your necklace, can I try it on?" And the first lady, who is very kind, says, "Yes, of course." The second lady runs away and says, "It's my necklace, it's not yours." So they have to go to the Bodhisattva, at this time aged 8 or whatever, to get the trouble sorted out. Now, what it says about each one of these sort of detective story mysteries is that the Bodhisattva immediately recognizes the culprit. But that is no good. It's no point in having wisdom that can't do anything. The real wisdom of the Bodhisattva is exercised through his ability to see within the situation a means whereby there can be a good and happy, beneficial outcome for everybody. So there are a number of occasions where he can see what's wrong, but he has to exercise his skill and means to see what to do. So he asks for a tub of water to be brought and for a perfumier to come. And he asks for the necklace to be floated in the water. And he says to the first woman, "What perfume do you use?" And she said, the second woman, "What perfume do you use?" And she said, "Oh, I use all flower bouquet." And it's a Pali word suggesting, I can't remember what it is, suggesting a very complex flower arrangement, as if she's really bought the most expensive Dior perfume and so on. And he asked the woman whose necklace it really was what perfume she used. And she said, "Oh, I can't afford perfumes, I just use panic grass." So they dropped the necklace in the tub of water, and he asked the perfumier to come and smell it. And the perfumier is asked, "What do you smell in the water?" And he said, "Panic grass." So the culprit is discovered, because of course, had she been the one who had perfumed and created the necklace, then it would have been in her very expensive perfume and not in the panic grass. So I think this is quite an interesting little story, because it shows, actually, oddly enough, a number of things which it's almost not intending to do. But the lady who could afford the rich perfume was much, much richer than the lady who made the necklace. And we are talking here about the 3rd century BC, when in Europe, if you were rich, justice was on your side. There wasn't a sense of egalitarianism. Acting as an assumption in this story is the fact that justice should be applicable to all castes and all levels of society. So in a way, a lot of the things that these stories say are things that are quite incidental, but which are assumptions at a time they would not be in the West. That principle would not be possible within a Western society at that time. Some of the other questions that the Bodhisattva has to deal with are things like riddles. The king decides to test him, and he asks him to send him a rope of sand because his has worn out. So the Bodhisattva is in a very difficult position. What do you do if you're asked to deliver something that's impossible? And he does what he does as a Buddha. He asks a counter question. He said, "Please could I see the one that is worn out so I can make it just the same?" So we have a number of these rather nice little stories that go on. They, at one level, they're just silly and funny, and but at another level, they actually do make you think, because all the techniques used in these stories are ones used by the Buddha, who was a very skilled politician in his final life. Counter questions, deploying deflecting attacks, finding ways around the situation. This is his creative morality, and that's why the Jātaka, I think, is such an extraordinary story, because it shows it being exercised in so many different ways. I'll just say a third out of, there are 19 riddles, so I won't tell them all. But the one I will tell is one which I think in a way sums up what the Bodhisattva does in these riddles. There is a jewel that can be seen in a big lake in the king's palace, and they can't seem to find a way of getting down to it. So the four stupid ministers, the silly ones, all try and devise ways of getting down to it, or draining the pool, or trying to think of ways they can find this jewel. But the Bodhisattva just comes and looks up in the tree and said, "Ah, the jewel is up there. It's reflected in the pool." So, in a way, you think, well, that's just such an obvious story. But actually, that is what is happening throughout this tale, this very creative way of looking at situations and seeing them sideways. And I think that is a great contribution, really, to our understanding of what it involves to have an ethical and moral stance. That you do actually have to be creative and adjust to situations, and you do have to look for applicability. I do think the Mahānipāta is a great story. I'm a literary expert, that's what I work on. So obviously the whole image of the tunnel and the people trapped in darkness when they're trying, this is at the end of the story when, to scare the enemy, the Bodhisattva traps them in a tunnel he's just built under their city, and they're all terrified and in darkness. And he doesn't let them suffer for too long, because he opens the door for them and all the lights go on. They have electric lights of some kind in this tunnel, and they're free, these people. And it's like a direct parallel with the teaching of the Buddha in his final life, of course. It's a symbolic way of showing the relief from darkness and the difficulty. Now there is one, I wanted to discuss these because I do think the Umaga is a very great story. I think it's one of the world's great works of literature. But I thought I would then just look at another story, the Kurudhamma Jātaka, because what interests me is the way that ethics and generosity are so often and carefully explained within the Jātakas. Now, most books on Buddhism you read say, well, Buddhism is about A, B, and C, and of course you have to do Sila and Dharma at the beginning, and they kind of are almost embarrassed about it. And time and again, I rather like the incident when I was in Sri Lanka and people were embarrassed about this Bodhi Puja. People almost feel that this is just for lay people, it's not very important, the Sila and the Dharma. I don't personally agree. I think the reason it is emphasised so greatly in Jātakas is because I think it's important at every stage of path and every stage of wisdom. If you have wisdom without generosity and warmth, it's not real wisdom. And so I feel there is actually something in the Jātakas that is being reiterated again and again for a reason. And I think this is particularly so in their understanding of ethics. And I'd just like to tell this story of the Kurudhamma Jātaka because it seems to me to have a very compassionate understanding of ethics, and again, one which I think we can apply to our own lives, and which is completely secular. There's no religious affiliation needed to understand it or even practice what it suggests. So the Kurus, this is Jātaka number 276, and at the moment it's my favourite one. So the Kurus are a people who are very well known for wearing white, practicing meditation, trying their best, and they do get things wrong sometimes, but they are well known at the time of Buddha as being a fairly exemplary society. And because of this, and this is the kind of magical relationship that you get in the Jātaka world, they are blessed with rain all the time. So, we're very lucky to have rain all the time. That's another subtext of this story. They are blessed and they are generous and they're happy because they keep the precepts. So they live in harmony with the world around them and the world responds. I think that's quite an interesting sort of ecological undertone there, that they actually respect the world around them and so they have a good climate. Now, they are near to another state where it never ever rains and where the people there are very unhappy and have drought and famine and are basically starving. So the king of the other kingdom, the Kalingas, said, well, go over to the Kurus and ask them for their auspicious elephant. And auspicious elephants feature a great deal in Jātakas because they're in Vasantara. He gives away an elephant. It's like the whole good luck of your city is contained within a magical elephant. But the Kurus are so generous that unlike the people of Vasantara's city, who complain when he gives away their elephant, they just say, oh, take away our magical elephant, it's fine. They just have quite unstinting generosity. But it still doesn't rain. So the king of the Kalingas realised he has to ask the Kurus what it is they're doing that is giving them a good climate, this climate which is giving them so much health and happiness. And he sends his missions with golden plates to write down what it is. So they decide to conduct personal interviews with a number of key figures in the city. A bit like trying to find the sort of key figures to interview about something. And to write down what it is that each person is doing that could be producing this wonderful climate. So the first one they go to is the king. And they say to him, could you please tell us what wonderful code you're following, that everything seems to go your way, the climate is favourable, the city is happy. And the king said, it actually shocks them because he says, no, I can't. You see, I don't think it's because of me. I've actually made a bit of a mistake recently. I went to a festival and shot some arrows, and 3 of them landed on ground, but I think the 4th one landed on a little animal and I killed it. So I don't think I'm the person you should be asking. So the emissaries said, and this is why the emissaries are so useful in this story, because they actually comment on the behaviour of the Kurus. And they say, but at no point did you think that you wanted to kill another being. And he said no. And they said, well, if you don't have volition or chaitana, you see, they're very Buddhist Brahmins, despite there being no Buddha around. They said, if you don't have chaitana, if you don't have the wish to kill, it was not an intentional killing of another being. Therefore, your sila is exemplary. Please write down what you know on these golden plates. So he writes down the 5 precepts, and he says, well, here's your plates. It's a bit like writing it down on a file or something. That's what I try and do, but I don't think I got it right. So I think you should go and see my mother, because she's actually much more moral than I am. So they go to see his mother, and she says, yes, we're very lucky in our city, but it's not because of me. I have 2 daughters-in-law, and to one I gave a wonderful bracelet, and the other one I just gave some sandalwood because I didn't have another bracelet. And I've been so upset by it ever since. I think I've been unfair. So I don't think it's because of me that our city's doing so well. And they get to say, if you give, you must give freely. You didn't do anything wrong. I think your sila is perhaps not as bad as you think. And she said, oh, no, I think you better go and see my daughter-in-law. She's much better sila than me. And they go and see the daughter-in-law, and she says, Yes, Society is very successful, but it's not because of me. She said about 2 months ago I had a moment of desire for somebody else apart from my husband, so I think I'm really not the person that's keeping this city going. So the emissaries, and again they offer really cogent comment, they say, but a moment of desire is not the same as breaking the precepts, is it? And she says, no, I suppose it isn't really. But so here's the 5 precepts, and gave it to them. Now the emissaries go down they interview all these people, so and each one of them thinks that they have done something wrong. So the viceroy has kept his horses overnight in the rain by mistake because he was invited by the king to stay the night. The priest, this is a very interesting one, he'd really, really wanted this beautiful carriage, and he went to the palace, and the first thing that happened to him when he walked in was that the king offered him the beautiful carriage, and he felt awful because he'd wished for it. So, and they say, but you haven't broken any sila by wishing for something. So he says, oh no, I suppose not. So each one of these characters has some, what we would call a scruple, or some problem with their own sila that makes them fail to see their own goodness because they are allowing it to be clouded over by some sort of doubt. The rice grower thought he hadn't quite measured the rice properly. The tax measurer wasn't sure if he'd put all the stores in the right place. The gatekeeper had been rude to a couple with their arms around one another, telling them off for flirting in public, and it was a brother and sister. And finally, each one of them sends the emissaries on until they get to the last one, which is the courtesan in the village. And the gatekeeper, who'd been the one before, says, just go and ask her because her morality is impeccable. So they went to ask the courtesan what her contribution to the state's success was, and she said, oh, I don't think it can be me. And they said, but we've heard that you are utterly scrupulous in all your dealings and treat all beings with equanimity, and you are completely fair, completely kind. She said, but she said, there was a problem. King Shakya, the king of the gods, gave me a lot of money so that I would only stay faithful to him. But it ran out, and I was just about to take some more money when he turned up. So I didn't do anything wrong, but I do feel bad about that. So they reassure her and say she has done nothing wrong and her moral code is exemplary. So why is this story so interesting? They then learn from every single one of these interviewees, go back to the state of Kalinga, and immediately they experience a wonderful climate change, and all the rain comes, everything's green, everything's back in harmony through practicing sila. So I love this story, partly because it has a slightly climactic, which could not have been anticipated at the time, a sense that if you behave well and are respectful to other beings, you will live in a good environment. But also really because of this way of dealing with rumination. The mindfulness movement has been very successful in the West, and one of the things they're trying to encourage is for us to have non-judgmental awareness, which I think is impossible because I'm always judging. But it is a very, I mean, when I say it's impossible, because if one is mindful of judgments too. But the reason they have to do this, of course, is because certainly in Western societies, we do have excessive rumination. We focus on our shortcomings, our faults, the things we aren't doing right, and we give what we would say would be them unwise attention. So to be mindful, you need to appreciate what you do as well. So that's why I chose this story, because I felt it was a very 21st century story about people who didn't see their own generosity and their own sila, but were practicing it and needed to be reminded of that. And I think it's a wonderful situation, a time like this, at a full moon, to come here and to reflect on the space that these stories give us, and that to let them, if you like, speak to us in a certain way. I do feel Jātakas have a great deal to offer the international community. They include some of the works I regard as being amongst the great works of world literature. And I also feel that the Buddhism they offer is very humane and compassionate, and shows us a way of dealing with the precepts that is much more kind to ourselves than we sometimes think. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.